On January 27, 2024, this little Killer Instinct cartridge for the original Game Boy was auctioned for a whopping and very surprising $1,528. And most crazy of all to me, this is even with the description saying it's untested, sold as is. The game isn't even guaranteed to work and still commanded over $1,500. At a glance, I'm sure you can see this front label is just a bit different than a normal copy. The white box with red text that reads, "Not for resale," means this cartridge was intended for use in a Game Boy kiosk. Depending on where you were, you'd occasionally see these in major retailers back in the early to mid-90s. Even though this is a much more rare copy of Killer Instinct, this high sale still came completely out of nowhere. With their intended nature of kiosks, it's an obvious fact that NFRs are significantly more rare and therefore more expensive, but the degree of just how much more rare some of these NFRs are compared to others in the set can be really crazy. A while back, I kept my eyes on these sets for a few years as I was piecing together the Super Nintendo, Nintendo 64, and Game Boy sets. It's one thing to be pretty darn obscure and hard to find, like an average of one copy showing up every month or two. Then you get into copies that show up less often, maybe once a season, only a few times a year. But then you come across the crazy ones that sometimes don't even show up for over a year straight, sometimes even 18 plus months. But the Killer Instinct NFR on the original Game Boy has seemingly gone a staggering 4 years without appearing for sale. And you want to know what it sold for back in 2020? You'd guess at least several hundred, if not maybe $1,000, right? Try $80. And the year before that, another copy sold for $65. This game just skyrocketed from middle of the pack pricing to being around $1,200 more valuable than the next closest. It might have you wonder, how in the world did something like this happen? If you've seen some videos on the channel before, I've talked about the not for resale sets many years ago. And back then, I noted how hard it was to come across a copy of this game. With this particular copy barely ever showing up, it's not hard to believe that it would go up in value, even quite a bit, but I never would have guessed that it would go for around 20 times the previous amount. That's the unbelievable thing though, when there's such a small quantity that if even only a few people want it pretty badly, it becomes a bidding war with so much anticipation built up over their months and even years of waiting. Another crazy example of this that I personally benefited from years ago was with Diddy Kong Racing on the N64. It went from being around $300 to over $3,750. It's what happened when a couple years went by without one showing up. But funny enough, as soon as this high sale happened, a handful of sellers decided they were fine selling their copy since all of a sudden there were 5 or 6 on eBay. But even with Killer Instinct's recent sale, none have popped up in the last 3 months, which is absolutely mind-blowing. I honestly can't believe it didn't pull at least 1 or 2 out of the woodwork, which makes you further realize and appreciate just how rare and hard to find the Killer Instinct NFR is on the Game Boy. It's really an insane set of games in this way. Some of the copies do sell every few weeks or a couple of months, barely often enough to establish some sort of average, but then you have copies that haven't even seen the light of day on a massive site like eBay for multiple years in a row, which can have crazy consequences in auction. If you want to learn more about these copies, be sure to check out the complete front label sets of the N64, Super Nintendo, and Game Boy. Last time I talked about the original Game Boy set, none of them were available on eBay. In closing, even with its rarity, I'm totally shocked to see Killer Instinct NFR go for anything more than $300 or $400 based on where it was, but I guess the sheer rarity of this not-for-resale cart is now something to behold as it has successfully leaped from pretty valuable to grail territory. Was this sale a fluke? Do you think if a working copy was listed, it would go for even more? Or was this just one of those weirdly overly competitive auctions that peaked the price despite it saying it's untested and sold as is? Really glad my friend sent this to me as he's still an avid collector. He was also the one that clued me in when GoldenEye NFR went for over $1,500. What else will we see in the future? Only time will tell, but safe to say, this was quite the highlight. Thank you guys so much for watching. I look forward to seeing you in the next videos, and hope you all have a great rest of your day.